So we were talking about a client that you worked with as part of the Supereden trial.
Yeah.
And he had some anxieties about going out.
Yeah.
And saying, could you just kind of give a bit of a summary of what his sort of presenting problems were?
Sure. So he had experienced a period of psychosis. He'd had some unusual experiences, which included hearing voices and feeling very paranoid, particularly about sort of others sort of meaning harm to him. But that had largely subsided. But yes, as you mentioned, so still lots of worry about going out, and some worry about what other people thought of him. And also this worry about this sort of terrible feeling coming on when he was out. And this feeling he'd had whilst being at home, and I think on some occasions with a friend. And he couldn't really, it was difficult for us to find a word to describe it, or words to describe it. But he was clear to say that it would be really sort of unbearable, really difficult, very painful. He'd almost be doing something, and suddenly this feeling would come on, and it would be really difficult to manage. And there was lots of worry about, if that came on when he was out, he just feels like he wouldn't be able to cope. And so that would, in some ways, feed into him sort of tending to avoid going out because of the fear of having to deal with that sort of pain and difficulty when he's not in his home, and he can't sort of manage it there.
Okay, so it sounds a little bit like his presentation, although slightly different, might have fitted into sort of like a panic cycle, for example, in fear of this feeling and being overwhelmed by it and not being able to cope, and then avoiding as a result. So I suppose within kind of standard CBT for panic, it might involve going out and doing graded exposure, or going out and doing some behavioural experiments and sort of testing some of those concerns out. I mean, was that the plan? Or were there sort of problems with kind of doing that? Did you have to make some adaptations for working with this person?
Sure, absolutely. I think we did at times go out, and try to do some thinking around how he was managing when he was out. I think the struggle was that he would tend to only go out with me when he felt all right himself. And when he was worried, he just wouldn't want to sort of try that out. There were times when he might feel a little uneasy, and we could try sort of going out for a walk, or trying to go out somewhere where there weren't too many people around. But generally, it was really difficult for him to even contemplate going out when he wasn't feeling himself. And so sort of typical graded exposure, it just felt like we had sort of, there was too much of a barrier to being able to do that. So we did sort of consider it and try it, and think about it. But it's just he was so resistant to doing that when he wasn't really feeling himself, that it's just difficult. So it felt like it was important to try and really challenge the I suppose thinking about the risks of this feeling coming on, and whether it was worth sort of risking this feeling coming on in order for him to achieve what he wanted. I think that's where it was really important to go back to the values and think about that, and acknowledge that it felt really uncomfortable, acknowledging that this was a real worry, and genuinely empathising, but recognising that actually this did limit his life, and mean that he was sort of not being able to move towards what he wanted.
Right, okay. And I suppose, again, sort of making comparisons with a kind of panic presentation, it does sound like actually this was quite different. It may have presented in some ways as the same, but the way that you had to work with it was actually quite different in this context. When people experience panic, often if you go out and do a sort of behavioural assessment, you can often see it, can't you? People getting very hot, very sort of panicky, and sort of see some of those symptoms kind of coming on. Did you sort of notice anything like that when you did go out? I
mean, he might look a little bit hot, a little bit flustered, but generally he managed really well when he was out. And I think that was again reflective of the fact that he would only really do that when he felt reasonably okay. And actually it was very difficult to sort of access many worries when he was out, or sort of reflections on what it was like to be interacting with people. We just didn't really get much material to be able to sort of use a more typical sort of CBT panic formulation. He would talk about sometimes maybe going to a self-service checkout rather than the sort of main checkout in a supermarket, so he didn't have to interact so much with people. But we could do a little bit around that, and sort of exploring him going to sort of speak to people more. When we went to a library, we could sort of test out him talking to a librarian and trying to use the computer when he wasn't so sure if he could manage that and what that would be like. So there were elements of the sort of more structured CBT approach that we could use, and sort of typical CBT for anxiety approach. But largely it was very difficult to do sort of really detailed behavioural experiments or assessments around the sort of worries when we were out.
So it sounds like working within the kind of social recovery oriented CBT framework, the adaptations you had to make were, firstly taking time to actually understand this quite unusual sensation that he was experiencing, which may or may not have had links with his previous psychosis and psychotic episodes, but also really understanding what it was that he wanted to achieve and using the values to weigh up the pros and cons of kind of carrying on how he was, or taking that massive step to actually try and challenge some of these worries in order to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I was so glad that we had done that values work sort of earlier on, because if I'd have just been making suggestions about what I thought would be helpful, then it probably would have not been useful to him or wouldn't have made sense to him. It was the fact that he'd come up with these ideas of what he wanted, and we were sort of trying to think about how it was in conflict with where he was at that time because of the worry, and so trying to integrate those two things and sort of help him make a step towards what he wanted was really useful, I think.
Great, that sounds really good.